If even one guard moves, it will dishonor the Pope himself. That's what Commandant Schmid warned before the funeral began. But as the coffin of Pope Francis emerged into St. Peter's Square, one guard did move, stepping forward with something no one expected, leaving the entire Vatican stunned. So what was hidden beneath his uniform? Before we reveal it, press the subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now without further ado, let's get into it. The polished black boots of Lance Corporal Lucas Baumann remain perfectly still against the ancient stones of St. Peter's Square. His Swiss Guard uniform, that distinctive swirl of blue, red and yellow, stood in stark contrast to the sea of mourning blacks and purples surrounding him. The morning sun caught the edge of his halberd, sending occasional flashes of light across the somber gathering. Dawn had broken reluctantly over the Vatican that day. A chill hung in the air, unseasonable for late April, though fitting somehow for the occasion. Mist clung to the cobblestones in patches, like fragments of night unwilling to surrender to morning light. As if the world itself was reluctant to begin this day, the day they would bury Pope Francis. By 8 a.m., the square had filled beyond capacity. World leaders sat in reserved sections, solemn-faced in dark suits and formal clothes. Behind them stretched a tapestry of humanity, the faithful with rosaries moving between weathered fingers, tourists with cameras hanging unused around their necks, nuns dabbing at eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Lucas kept his gaze fixed forward, his breathing measured beneath the weight of his breastplate. 14 years of service in the Swiss Guard had perfected his ability to remain motionless for hours, his face betraying nothing of the thoughts that might stir beneath the surface. Even on this day, perhaps especially on this day, his discipline would not falter. Or so everyone thought. From somewhere inside the basilica, organ music began. Low, mournful notes that seemed to vibrate through the very stones. The crowd stilled, the procession was beginning. First came altar servers with candles and incense, their young faces solemn beneath the weight of tradition. Then priests in white, bishops in purple, cardinals in deep crimson. A river of color and sacred symbolism flowing from the basilica's depths. And finally, the coffin. Simple cypress, as Francis had requested. No gold ornamentation. No elaborate carvings. Just a wooden box and bearing the crucifix, carried by 8 pallbearers in black. As it emerged into daylight, Lucas felt something press against his chest, hidden beneath his uniform, a weight known only to him. Lucas Baumann had never been the type of man people noticed, except when they needed to. 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a jaw like granite and eyes that gave away nothing. Born to a watchmaker in Lucerne, he had grown up surrounded by precision. His father's work table, covered with tiny gears and springs that measured life in careful increments, had been his first classroom. Everything matters, his father would say, magnifying glass pressed to his eye. The space between seconds is where craftsmanship lives. This philosophy followed Lucas through school, military service, and eventually to Rome. While other recruits struggled with the Swiss Guard's demands for perfection, Lucas absorbed them like a plant turning toward natural light. At 37, his record in the Pontifical Swiss Guard was spotless, a blank canvas of compliance. 14 years without a single citation for tardiness, never a uniform infraction, not one moment of inappropriate levity on duty. Baumann's like a blueprint for the rest of them, his commander once remarked. If I could clone him, I would. Only his roommate during training knew that Lucas kept a small wooden clock, his father's first creation, beside his bed. And only his roommate knew that sometimes, late at night, Lucas would wind it carefully before kneeling to pray. That morning of the funeral, though, something had shifted. As he stood before the mirror adjusting his uniform, his hands had trembled slightly. Just once, he'd stared at them as if they belonged to someone else. Then he'd reached into his breast pocket and touched something hidden there. The letter. And in that moment, standing alone in the barracks, something softened in his eyes, a hairline crack in perfect stone. The Swiss Guard didn't just wear tradition, they embodied it. Every ceremonial step, every precise angle of the halberd, every stoic stare had been refined through centuries of service. For a papal funeral, their duty wasn't simply security, it was symbolism. They were living monuments to unwavering fidelity. That morning, in the guards' private chambers beneath the Vatican, Commandant Schmid had addressed the funeral detail with unusual solemnity. The grey-haired officer moved slowly between the rows of guards, his voice low but penetrating. "Today, you carry 5 centuries on your shoulders," he'd said, adjusting a crooked tassel on a younger guard's uniform. "Perhaps more than any other day in your service, this one demands absolute precision. The eyes of the world will be upon us," Schmid continued, "not just Catholics, everyone. They will see in your stillness the Church's resilience, in your discipline her strength. Any deviation," he paused here, making brief eye contact with each guard, "any deviation will dishonor not only the pontiff, but the faith itself." Lucas had stood motionless, his breathing controlled, his face impassive. But behind that mask, his mind had drifted to another conversation, another room, another promise. "Visual perfection," Schmid was saying now, his voice hardening. "If even one guard moves, it will be the only thing the world remembers from this day." A muscle in Lucas's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Schmid stopped directly in front of him, studying him with narrowed eyes. "Something to say, Bowman?" "No, sir." "Perfect, immediate, respectful." Schmid nodded and moved on, but not before giving Lucas a final, lingering look, the kind veteran officers give when their instincts prickle without clear cause. As the guards filed out toward their positions, an older officer caught Lucas by the elbow just for a moment and leaned in. "Remember who you served today, Bowman," he whispered, "not just the office, the man." It had started with a child's cry. 5 years earlier, during an ordinary May audience, Lucas had been stationed near the colonnade when he'd heard it, a high, terrified wail cutting through the murmur of the crowd. A small boy, maybe 4 or 5, separated from his parents in the crush of pilgrims. Protocol demanded Lucas stay at his post. Radio for assistance. Maintain visual surveillance. Instead, he'd moved 15 feet from his position and lifted the child above the crowd until a frantic mother pushed through. A minor breach, quickly corrected, barely noticed, except by the Pope. 2 days later, a Vatican aide had appeared at the guards' barracks with a message. His Holiness requests Lance Corporal Bowman's presence alone. Lucas had followed the aide through the Apostolic Palace's labyrinthine corridors to a modest study where Pope Francis sat, not behind his desk, but in a simple chair by the window. Afternoon light streamed in, catching the dust motes in the air. "Your Holiness," Lucas had said, bowing deeply. "Sit, please," Francis replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his. His voice carried the slight rasp of age, but retained its distinctive warmth. When Lucas hesitated, the Pope smiled. "It's not a suggestion, son." "You know why I asked for you?" the Pope inquired, leaning forward slightly. "No, Your Holiness." Francis nodded toward a side table where a small security monitor displayed footage, grainy but clear enough, of Lucas lifting the crying child. "You left your post?" "Yes, Your Holiness, I apologize," for Francis raised a weathered hand. "Why did you do it?" Lucas paused, choosing his words carefully. The child was in distress. "So are many who come here," Francis countered gently. "What was different about this one?" Lucas shifted slightly, a barely perceptible movement that for him spoke volumes. "He reminded me of someone." The Pope waited, patient as stone. "My brother," Lucas finally said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "When we were young, there was a crowd at a festival in our town. He got separated. I couldn't reach him in time." He didn't elaborate further, didn't explain the hospital visit afterward, the broken arm, the nightmares that followed. "You know what I've noticed about the Swiss Guard?" Francis asked, changing direction. "You're trained to be seen but not noticed, to stand so still that people forget you're human." He leaned back in his chair. "It's necessary, of course, but dangerous too." "Dangerous, Your Holiness?" "For the soul," Francis clarified, "to separate duty from compassion is an artificial division. God doesn't recognize it." The conversation shifted then. Francis asked about Lucas's family, his hometown, told stories of his own youth in Buenos Aires, not as pontiff to guard, but man to man. "When I was young," Francis said, "I made a mistake. I chose institutional loyalty over human need. It haunted me. He looked out the window. Sometimes, Lucas, the holiest thing we can do is move when we're told to stand still. As their time ended, Francis rose with slight difficulty. There's a tradition in Argentina, he said, where we say goodbyes twice. Once for the body, once for the soul. He placed a hand briefly on Lucas's shoulder. Remember that when the time comes. Lucas had left the study changed in ways he couldn't articulate, like a clock whose internal mechanism had been subtly adjusted. Still functioning, still precise, but keeping slightly different time. 2 nights before the funeral, Lucas had been returning to the barracks after evening patrol, when a slight figure emerged from the shadows of St. Anne's Gate. Father Ventresca stooped now with age, his hair bone white, his hands like paper maps of creased rivers. "A moment, guard Bowman," the priest said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas stopped. Ventresca had been the Pope's personal secretary for over a decade. A quiet, watchful presence in the papal apartments. "It's rather unusual," Ventresca began, glancing around as if concerned about being overheard. But then he was an unusual man. From within his cassock, he withdrew a cream-colored envelope, sealed with the papal mark. No address, no formal insignia. Just a single line in shaky handwriting on the back. For the man who once stood guard in tears. He wrote several letters in his final weeks, Ventresca explained. Most to family, to close friends. This one, he was quite specific about its delivery. A pause. "He said you'd understand the timing." "How did he know I would still be here?" Lucas asked softly. "After all these years?" Ventresca's lips curved in a gentle smile. He said, "Some men stand guard because it's their duty, others because it's their nature." The old priest touched Lucas's arm briefly. "He knew which kind you were." Lucas waited until he was alone in his quarters, sitting on the edge of his narrow bed, before breaking the seal. The letter inside was handwritten on simple paper. No papal letterhead, no formal declarations. Just words in the distinctive, slightly uneven script of an old man, writing with an arthritic hand. "Lucas," it began, without preamble. "If you're reading this, I've gone to meet our Father. Strange how we spend our lives preparing for this journey, yet still approach it like bewildered travelers without a map. I've been thinking about our conversation from years ago, about the boy in the crowd, about your brother, about rules and when to break them. Because in you, Lucas, I recognized something rare. A man who stands guard, not out of duty to an institution, but out of love for what that institution should represent. Those are the guards we need most, especially when no one is watching. The world will tell you that discipline means remaining still when everything inside you says to move. Sometimes that's true, but the greatest discipline is knowing when movement serves a higher stillness. If one day you find yourself torn between the letter of tradition and its spirit, remember this: I saw you. God sees you. And perhaps that is enough. When the time comes for my final procession, I will not hear your footsteps, but I will feel them, Francisco." Lucas read it 3 times, each reading slower than the last. His hand trembled slightly, not with indecision, but with the weight of certainty. He carefully folded the letter and slipped it into the inner pocket of his uniform jacket, directly over his heart. The choir began to sing, "Jesus, Remember Me." The hymn Francis had chosen years before, simple plaintive notes rising above the square. Lucas watched the coffin's slow progression down the steps. Behind it walked the papal household, secretaries, attendants, long-time staff, their faces drawn with genuine grief rather than ceremonial solemnity. Among them, Father Ventresca moved slowly, one hand resting on the arm of a younger priest for support. As he passed Lucas's position, the old man's eyes lifted briefly, meeting the guard's gaze for the slightest moment. Something passed between them, unspoken, invisible to cameras and onlookers, but undeniable. Permission, understanding, recognition. The pallbearers lowered the Pope's coffin onto the bier positioned at the foot of the basilica steps. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re stepped forward, incense in hand, ready to begin the final commendation. The crowd held its collective breath, prepared for the familiar rhythm of ancient ritual. Lucas's fingers tightened, almost imperceptibly around the halberd shaft. The moment crystallized around him like ice forming on a still pond. Sudden, silent, transformative. In 14 years of service, he had never broken formation, never disrupted ceremony, never placed personal impulse above protocol. Until now. His first step was precise, not hesitant, but measured. The sound of his boot heel striking marble ricocheted through the hushed square. Those nearest him turned in confusion. Second step. Halfway to the coffin now. A cardinal glanced up sharply, his blessing momentarily forgotten. Third step. Standing directly before the simple cypress box that held Pope Francis. The world seemed to hold its breath. Every eye in the square, every camera lens fixed on the guard who dared to move when movement was forbidden. With mechanical precision, Lucas shifted his halberd to his left hand. His right reached slowly into his breast pocket. The movement was so controlled, so ceremonial in its execution that for a heartbeat, it almost seemed planned. From within his uniform, he withdrew the letter. Pale parchment against deep blue fabric. The papal seal visible to those closest. A private message suddenly made public in the most dramatic way imaginable. Then, in a motion that combined military precision with profound reverence, Lucas bent one knee to the ground. He placed the letter gently atop the coffin, precisely beneath the wooden crucifix. His gloved fingers lingered for the briefest moment. "For dein letzte Reise," he whispered. "For your final journey." The words weren't meant to be heard, just a private farewell in his native tongue. But in the perfect acoustics of the square, they carried to those nearest. A final intimacy made accidentally public. He rose, 3 steps backward, executed with the same precision as his approach. His halberd returned to perfect vertical position. His face composed once more into the mask of ceremonial stillness. The breach had lasted 28 seconds. Around him, reactions rippled through the funeral like concentric waves. A young priest crossed himself, though whether in shock or approval wasn't clear. Several cardinals exchanged glances of barely concealed alarm. From the diplomatic section, the German chancellor leaned toward her aide, whispering behind her hand, yet no one moved to interfere. No security personnel stepped forward. The letter remained on the coffin, its presence altering the ceremony in ways no one could have anticipated. Near the back of the procession, Father Ventresca watched with tired eyes that held a hint of something like satisfaction. 2 rows away, a younger Swiss guard stared at Lucas with an expression balanced between horror and admiration. And in the sea of faces filling the square, thousands of ordinary people witnessed something they couldn't fully understand, but somehow instinctively recognized. A moment when rigid tradition yielded to something more human, something perhaps more holy. The funeral mass continued. It had to. Billions were watching. The machinery of Vatican ceremony, honed over centuries, absorbed even this unprecedented breach like a river flowing around an unexpected stone. But beneath the surface, currents shifted. Inside the basilica, Cardinal Mancini leaned toward his aide. "That man will never wear the uniform again," he murmured, his Italian barely audible over the choir. The aide, young but Vatican-trained in discretion, kept his eyes forward. "It was the Pope's letter, Eminence." "That changes nothing." "It changes everything." When the final blessing concluded, Cardinal Ray approached the coffin for the last commendation. For a breathless moment, the entire assembly wondered, would he remove the letter? Acknowledge it somehow? He did neither. With a slight but perceptible adjustment to his movement, the cardinal swung the incense around the coffin in a way that carefully avoided disturbing the paper. It was the smallest gesture, plausibly deniable. Yet to those who understood Vatican subtlety, its message was clear. This too belongs. Evening shadows lengthened across the Vatican gardens. The crowds had dispersed. The world's dignitaries had returned to their embassies and hotels. Pope Francis's body had been sealed in its final coffin, ready for interment the following morning. Lucas sat alone in a small antechamber connected to Cardinal Favreau's office. No clock on the wall, no window to mark time's passage. He had been waiting for 73 minutes. The door finally opened. not a secretary or aide, but Father Ventresca himself, stooped with age, but moving with the quiet authority of a man who had witnessed papal transition since the days of Paul VI. "They are ready," he said simply. Inside, 3 men waited around a small table. Cardinal Favreau, prefect for the Congregation of Divine Worship, sat with his hands folded atop a leather portfolio. Beside him, Commandant Schmid of the Swiss Guard looked strangely diminished without his ceremonial uniform. Archbishop Tremblay completed the triangle, his thin face illuminated by a single desk lamp. No recording devices, no secretaries, no formal charges read aloud. Just 4 men and the weight of tradition between them. "I think we can dispense with preliminaries," Favreau began. "Your actions today were witnessed by approximately 50,000 people in the square, and several billion via broadcast." His tone wasn't accusatory, merely factual. "The question before us is not what you did, but why." "I received a letter from His Holiness," Lucas finally said, "written before his death. It was delivered to me 2 days ago, by Father Ventresca." The old priest nodded confirmation. "The letter was personal," Lucas continued, "but in it, the Holy Father. He helped me understand that sometimes our highest duty isn't to protocol." Commandant Schmid leaned forward. "You broke your oath, Bormann, the most fundamental principle of the Guard, centuries of tradition." "With respect, sir," Lucas replied, meeting his commander's gaze directly, "I believe I honored the deeper meaning of that oath. An interesting interpretation, one that would make discipline impossible if widely adopted." Lucas hesitated. "The original remains with His Holiness, but I made a copy of one portion." From his pocket, he withdrew a folded paper and placed it on the table. Cardinal Favreau picked it up, adjusted his reading glasses, and read aloud, "If one man can carry love into tradition, then let him do so bravely." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "These are the Holy Father's words." "Yes, Your Eminence." A heavy silence fell over the room. Cardinal Favreau removed his glasses, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief, a delaying tactic as ancient as the Church itself. "The difficulty we face," he finally said, "is one of competing truths. The discipline of the Swiss Guard is essential and must be maintained. Yet Pope Francis often reminded us that mercy sometimes requires flexibility. This sets a dangerous precedent," Schmid frowned. "Only if widely known," Archbishop Tremblay countered. "The specific circumstances, a personal letter from the Pope himself, unique enough to be contained." Cardinal Favreau studied Lucas directly. "Do you believe tradition allows for such personal gestures, Guard Bormann?" "No, Your Eminence," Lucas replied honestly. "Tradition doesn't allow it, but perhaps sometimes tradition needs to be reminded why it exists in the first place." After a long moment, Cardinal Favreau nodded almost imperceptibly. "We will take no formal action regarding today's incident. No public statement will be issued. But understand, Guard Bormann, what you did cannot become precedent. Your service record remains unblemished," Favreau continued, "but adjustments to your posting will be necessary for practical reasons." Lucas understood the unspoken message. He would not be dismissed, but he could no longer serve in highly visible ceremonial positions. Too many had witnessed his breach. Too many questions would follow. "I understand, Your Eminence." As they rose to leave, Father Ventresca placed a gnarled hand on Lucas's arm, holding him back momentarily as the others filed out. "He knew, you know," the old priest said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What it would cost you." Lucas met the priest's rheumy eyes. "It cost less than failing him would have." Ventresca smiled faintly. "Yes, that's exactly what he would have said." The reassignment came 3 days later. A simple envelope slipped beneath Lucas's door before dawn. No official ceremony. No public acknowledgement. Just a typed notice bearing the seal of the Secretary of State. Effective immediately, Guard Lucas Bormann is transferred from Ceremonial Division to the Apostolic Archives. The Archives. The Vatican's vast underground labyrinth of history, miles of shelves, millions of documents, centuries of secrets preserved in climate-controlled solitude. Tourists never saw it. Cameras never filmed it. The perfect place to tuck away a guard whose face had flickered across the world's screens in an unprecedented moment of disciplined rebellion. Not punishment, exactly. Not exile. But definitely removal. Lucas reported to his new post without complaint. He exchanged his ceremonial uniform for the simpler black attire of the Archives Division. No halberd. No colored stripes. Just an understated insignia marking him as security rather than scholar. His new supervisor, Monsignor Deza, was a thin, dust-colored man who spoke 6 languages but preferred silence to all of them. "You'll patrol the outer corridors mainly," he explained, his voice as dry as the parchment surrounding them. No bags permitted beyond the reading room. No pens, only pencils. "I won't mention the funeral," he added, studying Lucas briefly. "This is the Vatican. What happens above stays above." Weeks passed. The papal conclave began filling the Vatican with speculation and politics. But deep in the archives, such concerns seemed distant. Here time moved differently, measured in centuries rather than news cycles. Yet something had changed within him. The letter, the original now buried with Pope Francis, had altered something fundamental in his understanding of duty. Not weakening it, but deepening it. Giving it roots beyond mere obedience. His fellow guards still nodded to him when their paths crossed, but with a certain wariness, as if his breach had marked him as different in ways they couldn't articulate. Only one, a younger guard named Thomas, ever mentioned it directly. Was it worth it? He'd asked one evening, finding Lucas alone in the guard's chapel. Lucas had considered the question carefully. It wasn't about worth, he'd finally replied. It was about rightness. One Tuesday afternoon, deep in the pre-medieval manuscript section, Lucas came across